thank Les Zaitz, publisher of the Malheur Enterprise, for joining us. He's a longtime investigative journalist who has this great recipe for apple pancakey things, which he'll talk briefly about in the end. But what I wanted to talk to you about as a longtime investigative journalist who's, been at the forefront of uncovering and holding elected officials accountable and getting information out specifically to people in a rural area. What are you seeing now is the difference now that we're in a pandemic and we need to get information out between what we've got now versus what we had 10, 20 years ago?
Yeah, great question, Val. Thanks for having me. A number of things I'd like to address about this. As we came into the pandemic, the profession of journalism in Oregon and across the United States is under terrible compression. There are roughly half the number of reporters at work anywhere in the country as 20 years ago. Newspapers are diminishing or closing. Local radio stations are just not the force that they once were. So the American people and Oregonians just have a fewer choices for where they can turn for credible information. And there are fewer of us keeping an eye on people like you, public officials who have great authority over the rights and abilities and the freedoms of Oregonians and our money, our tax money. And so that's a deeply troubling development for me as a reporter who's been in Oregon for 45 years of doing this, that the majority of public officials, whether it's a city councilman or the leader of the state justice department, the attorney general, I'm convinced that most people come to this work with noble ambitions, an adherence to integrity and to honesty. But as you know, in public service, as in banking and insurance and car sales, there are a slice of folks who will take advantage of their power and authority, and it's our job, my job as a reporter, to watch for those folks that color outside the lines and abuse that authority. But the concern is that as the number of reporters in Oregon, for example, diminishes, that you have fewer people keeping an eye on the local school district. If it's going out for a bond measure, who's going to question, really, do you need that extra music room? Or is it just something sort of gild a resume on the way out the door as a superintendent? So that's a concern. So we came into the pandemic limping a bit as a profession. And then, of course, the pandemic has just dramatically layered on critical responsibilities for journalists in Oregon and across the United States. In other words, right now, people need, as fast as they can get it, credible information that affects their lives, how they conduct themselves with their families, with their friends and colleagues, how businesses operate. And as you well know, Val, the range of the caliber of information available goes from facts that you could trust to information that is simply made up to stir up social media chatter. And so in my news organization in Malheur County, way on the eastern fringe of the state, we feel a deep responsibility to our community to stay on top of this topic, to report on health developments, to report on COVID infections, and equally important is to report how public officials are responding to this crisis. Are they reacting fast enough? Are they doing enough? Are they making good judgments? At the state level, we've seen some stumbles. The Oregon Employment Department is just getting hammered because of its struggles to keep up with the unemployment benefits. The Oregon Health Authority and the governor's office, frankly, have stumbled with their commitments to transparency. And when people sense that someone's trying to hide the information, the question becomes, well, what are they hiding and why are they hiding it? So I don't think those agencies have particularly helped themselves in a time when they really need public credibility. And that's the end of my speech.
That's, I think you're exactly right. And the other piece of it, so I'm in the Mid Valley, a lot of the information that we're getting here is from Portland. And so people
Yes.
down here just don't feel connected because, and you're in Malheur County, so you're that much more removed, that there's a reality for Portland, and there's also a distrust. We have like this, you used to be, you'd watch one news source, we'd watch Walter Cronkite. You and I might have a different opinion about what he said, but we weren't getting different facts. And right now we have people watching news where they're getting different facts. So you also started the Salem News to sort of keep an eye on what was happening at our capital. Do you want to talk about that? You've got some amazing young reporters that are doing great work. I know, because they question me and it's no holds barred, right? Like it is, they're really good reporters.
No, we founded the Salem Reporter, which is an all digital news source that was really came into being to help fill what I saw and the other founders saw as a significant erosion of coverage in one of the largest cities in Oregon. And there's also significantly diminished coverage of the base industry in Salem, which is, of course, the state government. So, we've got a team of 3 reporters augmented by some excellent photographers and freelance writers who have dug in very hard during the pandemic to keep the Salem community apprised of what's going on. A good example of that is, became apparent in early April that Marion County had an infection rate that was all out of whack with what the rest of the state was experiencing. And there was very few explanations coming from county or state health authorities. And so Salem Reporter dug in pretty hard to ask pretty tough questions of those who are responsible for identifying and containing the virus, and of the social service organizations that are supposed to swing into action to protect these communities. And so I felt, Val, that we've filled a pretty significant void there to answer that question as best we could. Why did this happen in Marion County? And it goes to the culture of Northern Marion County, where you have a mix of farm laborers that speak up to 8 different languages. It's not just Spanish. You have a Russian community that is in some ways pretty isolated. So, what we did in Salem is what we do over in Vail as much as we can, is we look around and what's happening in the community that we can help explain and dig into for people who have no other resource.
So I guess my next question would be, number one, what would be your advice to people on how to check and see if the news that they're reading and sharing, because now social media, it's a bit of a free-for-all, that it is accurate, and what can we do to support local news sources to maintain that checks and balance?
Boy, that's a great question, and there are conversations going on all over the country trying to address those. I guess the most simple answer is here in Oregon. I would recommend that people be aware of where that information came from and how it's presented. Is it citing authoritative sources? If you see some story that cites as its main source of fact, the Institute of, left-wing nut job Institute of America, you ought to be a little suspicious about that is not CBS or CNN. So I would be on guard about websites in particular that sound authoritative, but really are just masking a particular ideology or a particular point of view. And I think most readers, frankly, are discerning about that. You all know when something has a feel of substance to it, and when it has sort of a paper thin, well, we're going to skate across the potholes in our facts and get you to the other side. So in assessing information, how long has the news source been around? What is its credibility, whether it's the Oregonian or KTVB, or people in their communities know who the local news sources are. At a national level, that's much, much more challenging these days because the media market has been so sliced and diced. And it's even challenging for journalists to look at that national landscape and decide, well, can I trust this site? Can I trust Politico? Can I trust The Hill? Can I trust the New York Times? Again, I'm looking for citations to authoritative sources, the Harvard Medical School. I'm looking for credible sources, Val Hoyle from the State Labor Commissioner talking about these issues, as opposed to some brand new lawyer out of Coos Bay who pretends to have authority over labor issues. And so it's not an easy challenge these days, but I think people need to apply judgment. They need to find credible sources, because it's that information that people act on. And if you have bad information, you're going to make some bad decisions.
Yeah, and we've seen that, and it's shared across Facebook. I can't tell you how many times on social media I've gone back to people I know going, you should, or family members, you really should check that source. That doesn't make any sense, so I think we have to police ourselves. And what can we do to support more local journalism?
Well, look, particularly during the pandemic, whether it's a newspaper or a broadcast outlet, the model of relying on paid advertising to support the cost of gathering the news has just been vaporized. So everybody's under financial strain to continue to pay for the cost of sending reporters and photographers out into the field. So more of us are switching to two primary sources, frankly, Val. Number one, paid subscriptions. And you just saw this with the Oregonian. They just not too long ago began taking what they consider voluntary subscriptions, but they needed to find some way to subsidize the great work done by my former colleagues at the Oregonian. And the Salem Reporter, we are an all digital news service that depends almost entirely on subscriber support. And so whether it is in Salem or Portland or Medford or Lakeview, what Oregonians can do to say that they want credible information and they will pay for it is simply to subscribe. And there are a number of organizations that, frankly, and Salem Reporter is among them, that now do something we would have never thought of 2 years ago, which is accepting direct financial support. We allow readers to provide contributions that help keep us doing the work that we do. And so that's how Oregonians can make sure that the screen doesn't go dark, that the websites don't disappear that are providing essential news, because this is not going to be done for free. And the idea of creating nonprofit models, and that's a whole nother subject, sort of mask over our responsibility to provide something that people want to support. I mean, that's really sort of foundational to the future of this business, is that I, as a publisher and an editor, have to make sure that the news I'm providing the community is something that you want.
That's right. Well, and thank you for continuing to ask the hard questions and having those checks and balances. As you said, most elected officials come into this profession because we want to do something to help people. And sometimes they think, the end justifies the means. And if we don't have eyes on, then who knows about that? So I appreciate it. Now, I will say we will soon come into apple season, and you have a recipe that has to do with apples. Do you want to share a little bit about that, or a story about it?
Yeah, well, I'm not much of a cook. My wife could tell you that in an instant. But I do have a couple of specialties, and one of my most favorite ones is a Dutch apple baby, or apple Dutch baby, I guess I call it, where chop up 3 good crisp green apples in little bite-sized pieces and mix it in with cinnamon and apple flour and eggs, and you've got the recipe. And I put that in an iron skillet, put it in the oven for 40 to 45 minutes, and at my place, which is the Boulder Creek Ranch out in wonderful Grant County, Oregon, that is sort of one of our signature servings out here, and family and friends line up for that treat. And I owe this to my former reporting partner at the Oregonian, Jim Long. He and I worked together for many, many years back in the 80s, and I would occasionally go to Portland, stay with Jim and his family. And Jim cooked us up one day, and I think I ate about half of the pan in one sitting, and demanded that he give me the recipe.
It looks amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you. We're going to share your recipe, share your words. Again, thank you for keeping independent journalism and in our state. It's critical now more than ever that we have a place we can go to find real information. And I hope you enjoy your day. Want to see more What's Cooking with Val? Make sure to subscribe to our page by clicking the link.